So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our brilliant speaker this evening. So it's Professor Jane Hill, who will be asking the question, how do butterflies help us understand climate change? So that's over to you, Jane.
Great, thanks so much, Matt. I'll just start sharing my screen. So hopefully you can see that. Okay, that's brilliant. Thanks, Matt. Okay, thanks everyone, and thanks everyone for coming, and thank you ever so much, Matt and Ed, for inviting me. And so what I'm going to talk to you this evening is about understanding how about butterflies and climate change, and how butterflies tell us things about the fingerprint of climate change, how it has an ecological impact. But then, of course, we also need to be thinking about how climate change is affecting butterflies themselves. So I'll be taking both sides of that debate, if you like. One of them is about how butterflies tell us about how climate change is affecting our communities, but also thinking about how climate change is affecting butterflies themselves, and thinking a little bit about the conservation of these really important and beautiful insects. So hopefully you'll come away with both of those ideas and thinking about both of those components about what I'm talking about this evening. And so before I want to kick off and talk about butterflies and climate change this evening, I just want to start off by thanking everybody who's been involved working with me over what has been many years on this topic. So these are some of the many groups of people I've worked with, whether they've been in the research group at York, or whether they've been groups that I've worked with elsewhere, particularly groups at UKCEH and Butterfly Conservation. As you'll probably realise, I make a lot of use of those data and the absolutely fantastic data sets that they've got, that have allowed me and many of my colleagues and collaborators to address really interesting and important questions around butterflies and climate change. So thanks ever so much to all of those people listed there, plus many more. So as we know, and we're seeing it in the news and the media all the time, we know that climate change is happening. And one of the things that I reflect on a lot is that actually over the period of my career and the time that I've been working on climate change and butterflies, there's a much greater recognition and understanding about how climate change is affecting our ecosystems, and much more information coming in about the impacts that that's having. And of course, we see a lot of the records are being broken all the time. The last decade has been the hottest, or recently hottest years. And of course, the COP26 meeting last year, November in Glasgow, was thinking about the degree to which we are going to keep global peak warming below those 2 degrees. And that's something I might come back to later on in my talk, because that's going to be really important when we're thinking about conserving biodiversity, particularly those parts of biodiversity that are threatened by climate change. So straight away, I'd like to move on to start thinking about why are butterflies important. And it always surprises me that I do occasionally come across people who don't think butterflies are important, but mostly people recognise how beautiful they are and how important they are, and how they value them and enjoy recording them and seeing them in the green spaces around where they live. So thinking a little bit about why butterflies are so important, and I suppose it's from the context of thinking about why they're important to help us understand climate change, because they have other values as well, but thinking very much about why they're important for climate change. Well, first of all, they are highly visible, so they're easy to record, easy to see, and they are hugely popular with people just because they're such beautiful insects to have around us. And I guess because of that, they're incredibly well studied. So for the species that occur in the UK, we know ever such a lot about their natural history, about what the larvae feed on, and what their site preferences are. And that means that we can ensure that locations are good for species if we are wishing to improve their abundances and the fates of them at sites. As I say, they're quite easy to identify by eye, and we've got relatively low diversity in the UK. So you've only got about 60 species that you need to learn. And we're talking about residents here. So these are species that breed in the UK, but about 60 of them. The other thing is that they have short generation times. So they go from an egg through larvae and pupae to adults back round to an egg again quite quickly, in a year or less. And that means that they respond quickly to changes in the environment, whether that's the environment deteriorating or getting better for them. And then finally, because they're cold-blooded, they're very sensitive to the ambient temperature. So everything that they do is determined by the temperature of their surroundings. And so they're hugely sensitive to local changes in weather and also long-term trends in the climate. We start thinking about how butterflies are responding to these changes in the climate. Well, there's a number of ways in which they could respond, and I'm going to go through these different ways in the rest of my talk. So they can shift their range to keep track of the climate, and that's probably one of the ways in which most people are aware of how butterflies are providing a fingerprint of climate change because of the dynamism of their ranges and how they're shifting to track climate. So the other option, of course, is that they can stay put and try and adapt to those changes. And those sorts of local adaptations that we see can be genetic, or they can be what we term plastic, or an environmental response. And the sorts of things that we might be thinking about here are about changes to the timing of life cycle events. So that's early emergence of adults in the spring, for example. And then the other thing that we do also see is that they go locally extinct as a consequence of the climate becoming unsuitable for them. So those are the sort of three main types of response we see, and I'll take you through the evidence that we see for those in the UK. So shifting, adaptation, and then patterns of extinction. I'd just like to say a few things about why we focus on British butterflies. And I think people are often surprised to know that out of all of the taxonomic groups worldwide, butterflies are probably one of the best. Maybe they're beaten by birds, but probably one of the best for which we know how many species there are globally, where they occur, and have a good understanding about patterns of distribution and abundance trends. And probably globally, Britain has the best data sets. So by that we mean going back over the longest period of time and the most detailed information across the British Isles. And that's probably a combination of there being relatively few butterflies, a lot of people out looking for them, and a relatively small area to go out and look for them. So really good coverage. So vast amounts of information, particularly since the 1970s. So particularly since a period over which we know humans have been having an impact on the climate. So that generates lots of atlases of distribution change, as you can see up there, as well as transect walks to monitor abundance trends. So I'll come back to this shortly, but we have basically two types of data for butterflies. These are occurrence records and also the walk and count transects on abundances. And of course, we've been recording butterflies in the UK even before the 1970s. And I've put there Lady Glanville, who was one of the first recorded people in the UK to be looking at butterflies. And then I've put the maps there at the bottom to show three species globally in Europe, to highlight an important thing about the UK, and that is that many species reach their northern cool range margins in Britain. So when we're thinking about range shifts and distribution changes, then these range margins fall across the UK. So we can go out to the range margins and see where species are turning up or disappearing right at their range edge. And you can see there I've picked out three patterns where you can see the edge of the range is occurring somewhere in the UK. And actually being based in York, where I am, is a really great place to be based, because many species reach either their northern and southern range limits in Yorkshire. And so you can go out very easily and look at range changes. So lots of really good reasons why we focus on butterflies in the UK. And just to out that if you're interested in any of these results, they're all coming about because of citizen scientists going out and collecting data. So if you're at all interested, please do go out and contribute to these data sets and add to the valuable information that we can then crunch and analyze to come up with really important findings. So if you're interested in this and you love butterflies, then why not become if you're not already, of course, why not become a citizen scientist? So you can download iNaturalist app to your phone and record things that you see as you're walking around. Or if you're super keen, you could even set up a transect walk, and there's information there from the UK BMS website if that's something you'd like to do as well. And the other plug I'll give for another interesting project at CH. I'm not at all involved with these. I just think they're really interesting ones. If you had downloaded the iNaturalist app and you're interested to see where you could do the most good to go out and record biodiversity, well, this Decide project that's just started will help you work out where the best locations are so that you can best record and add to the data sets. So if you're really interested, and I guess you could perhaps combine that with where you're looking to go on holiday or for a weekend away or whatever, that would be a great way to add to those data sets. So I just want to start talking about what we know about flow range shifts then. I'm going to go back, but it still captures a lot of what our thinking is around this topic. And it shows that many animals in the UK are heading northwards, and that's what those histogram bars show. So the zero line here, anything above that zero line shows that there has been a northward shift in the range margin recently. And anything, as you can see here, there's only a few of the histogram bars that point down. So there's only a few things retracting southwards. Don't worry too much about the different colours of the bars. That's just a statistical controlling for recorder effort. It's the amount by which those bars are pointing upwards, showing those northward shifts. So as you can see across this wide range of taxonomic animal groups, most things are shifting northwards. And I've pointed out there where the butterfly examples are. So two things to pick out from this is that there's a lot of variation amongst the groups. So that's amongst both the different taxonomic groups and also the species within the group. So in other words, we already know from quite a long time ago that there are winners and losers from climate change. So that's the most important thing, is about that level of variation, because we spend quite a lot of time trying to understand why there is variation. So that's one thing to note from this plot. The other thing to note is that if the species were keeping perfect track of the climate change and moving around dynamically in the landscape to track the climate as it was changing, then they would fit that red line. All of those histogram bars would reach that red line that I've drawn across. And as you can see, with the exception of arguably the dragonflies there at the end, nothing is keeping perfect track of climate. So there are lags. So one of the things we've been very interested in looking at is to try and understand why things are shifting, but they are lagging behind the climate change. So two things here: things are moving northwards, but they're lagging behind the amount of climate change that is happening over the period of the study. I'll just focus on a few winners. Some of you may be familiar with these. These are species that are doing really well in the UK, and they are heading northwards, some of them at quite a fast rate. So just to emphasize, these are resident species. We're not talking about the well-known migrants like the painted lady, for example, that travels thousands of miles. These are resident butterflies, and they're shifting northwards and moving and breeding and moving and breeding as the climate is warming. And I'm sure some of these will be familiar to you, be in your garden or on your allotment or wherever that would be. And when you work out across all the species how fast they're shifting, it's just under 2 kilometres a year on average that they're moving their breeding ranges northwards. So for some of these species that are quite small, they've got quite powerful dispersal ability to be able to keep moving at about 2 kilometres a year on average. But quite a lot of variation amongst these species. I'll give you an example of some of the data sets that you can analyse to look at the degree to which species are shifting their range. I would say these data get out of date very quickly because of the degree to which something like the speckled wood here, as you can see, is moving northwards. So each of those green squares is a 10 by 10 kilometre record of occupancy as it's shifting the range northwards. You can see there's some complexity about its range shifting in England versus Scotland. We could come back and talk about that if you're unaware of its natural history and why it has that big gap in the centre of Scotland. But you can see how fast it's moving, and that's moving faster than the average, just under 4 kilometres a year. But if we go to a really fast one, well, then it's the comet, and this map is got out of date very quickly, going over 10 kilometres a year, at which it's spreading northwards up into Scotland very, very rapidly. So if you are a citizen scientist contributing to these records, this is the sort of way in which we start to analyse how ranges are shifting. You might ask, well, how do we go about measuring range shifts? Well, these are the sorts of maps we generate. So we take what we'd say time slices at different time periods to work out the distribution. And here's an example for one particular butterfly in the UK. And one key measure is we try and work out where its range margin is located. And as you can see there, depending on how you might analyse it, whether we might take particularly well-recorded squares or whether we take less well-recorded squares, shown in red or yellow there, then you can work out where the range margin is in terms of the distance north in the UK. And you can see there 3 time periods with 3 range margin locations, and then you can compute how that has changed over time. So that's one way of doing it. And as you can see there, we've also plotted locations that have been visited to find to look for butterflies, but where that particular butterfly wasn't recorded, and those empty dots. So that's how we measure the range shifts. And then when you crunch all of that information across a wide range of butterflies, and we've included moths here as well, you can start to look at general patterns. And I've plotted those in 3 ways. So on the right there, there's the range margin information and how much that has changed over time. So that's the plot on the right. And in all 3 plots, the green vertical dotted line shows the no change location. And as you can see there, if most of the species are to the right of that line, so they are shifting northwards, polewards, in other words. And the middle plot there shows the extent to which the size of the distribution has increased or not. And again, the green dotted line shows no change or increase over time. So you can see most butterflies and moths in the UK have increased in distribution extent, as well as moving northwards in the UK over this period of time. And then if you move to the left-hand plot, then this is an abundance plot. So this is from the Walk and Count transects. This then shows a different pattern. So again, this green dotted vertical line shows no change. So actually we might be expecting a lot of the butterflies to show an increase in abundance, given most butterflies generally like it when it gets warmer and sunnier, which is what you might expect from climate change. But actually what we see is most of the species fall to the left of that line. So even though their distribution and range margin is increasing, they're actually declining in abundance at sites. So there's a bit of a mixed message in there. So some increases, but declines in abundance trends. And just to add to the complexity, sorry, I won't be showing too many of these graphs, but just to add to the complexity, the responses to climate change themselves change over time. So what we're now showing in this plot is that study that Louise Mayer did was she took a long temporal period of study and divided it up into different time intervals, different chunks, if you like. So you can look at the change from time 1 to time 2, and then the change from time 2 to time 3. And that's what she's plotting here. And we naively thought that what a butterfly did in the first time period would predict what it would do in the second time period. And what these graphs show is that that is not the case. So each dot on these plots here is a species, and there are no regression lines or correlations plotted here because there are no relationships. So the fate of a butterfly in the first time period did not predict what it would do in the second time period, which surprised us quite a lot. So that's why these plots here show just a sort of cloud of dots. So why is that, you might ask? And that's what Louise went on to try and disentangle. Well, she found that there was some predictability in understanding these patterns, but what it was the limiting factors determining how species were responding to climate change themselves changed over time. So in the earlier time period, the amount of habitat available for the species was what was limiting their patterns of range change. It didn't matter about their dispersal ability and the degree to which they were increasing or decreasing at a site, their abundance trends, that didn't matter either. But as you can see here, as you move to the later time period, habitat availability no longer becomes a good predictor. Dispersal ability remains as a poor predictor, and abundance trends are what determines their response. And so we conclude that over time, this pattern of decline in abundance at sites is now determining the degree to which species can respond to climate change. So in other words, the local abundance trends of a species need to be positive at a site in order for a species to shift its range northwards. So again, that's why butterflies are such a great group to work with from trying to tackle these questions, because we have both the abundance data from the walk and count transects and these species records from the citizen science records. So just move on to think about some of our northern species. So we've got 4 northern butterflies. So not every species in the UK likes it hot and sunny down in sort of southern Britain. There are some species that like it cooler. And these are the 4 species that we focused on. So this is work that Dr. Aldina Franco did to understand changes in these northern species. So these are species that we might think are going to be particularly detrimentally impacted by climate change, because climate change will be making it too hot and too dry at the sites where they currently occur. This is exactly what Aldina found. So she went back to resurvey sites where there were records from the 1970s to find out whether the butterfly still occurred there or not. And sadly, she found large local extinctions of these northern species when she went back. And for these examples here, you can see on the left, you got the Scotch Argus, extinct at about a quarter of the sites that she visited, and of which she estimated that about 3/4 of those were because the climate had deteriorated. And then the northern brown Argus, even higher levels of extinction, and about half of those extinctions are climate driven. So perhaps not surprisingly, these cool loving and northern species, they really have nowhere to shift to, and through climate change, what we're seeing is their ranges are continuing to retract northwards, so sort of doomed to become have much more restricted distributions as the climate continues to warm. So what about this role of habitat in explaining some of this variation then? So some of the very early work we did on speckled wood showed how important habitat was for range expansion. And this study showed that if you compare expansion of the species in Scotland and in Yorkshire, then habitat is determining the speed of expansion. And that map on the right there no longer shows a butterfly distribution, it shows woodland cover in the UK. And as you can see, there's a lot more woodland in Scotland than there is in Yorkshire, and much greater woodland means that in Scotland, the butterfly has been expanding its range much more quickly. So the amount of habitat in the landscape is crucial for allowing species to spread through landscapes and respond quickly. So we've been looking to see how we could perhaps help species respond. So some work by Katie Threadgill looked very specifically to see how agri-environment schemes might help in terms of improving connectivity and therefore sort of helping habitat creation within landscapes. And of course, for agri-environment schemes, in this particular example, she was looking at grassy field margins, so thinking about how they could help connectivity for grassland species. So this was a computer modelling exercise where she was gathering information on the current agri-environment schemes across England and running connectivity models to see how they boosted connectivity in the landscape or not. And she found that, yes, they did help. Agri-environment schemes did have a benefit, but they only helped certain types of species, and they probably wouldn't be helping those species that were most needed in terms of help. We're just thinking about a little bit more now about some of these the other features of how butterflies are telling us something about climate change, but also how climate change is impacting butterflies. One of the key fingerprints of climate change, I guess, is about earlier spring emergence of insects. So these are phenology advances, as we call them, or the fact that we see things happening earlier in spring as the springs get warmer. And one of the questions we wanted to know is not only is this happening and the extent to which it's happening, but if you like, does it matter? Is this detrimental for butterflies emerging earlier or not? So this is some work that Callum McGregor focused on to understand the degree to which butterflies were emerging earlier or not, and did it matter? So not surprising, there's a very strong signal of earlier emergence of butterflies, and these data sets for butterflies give a very clear signal of that. But what he found was that only certain groups of butterflies benefited from this earlier emergence, and other butterflies were detrimentally impacted. So those butterflies that get through multiple generations a year, so-called multivoltine ones, multiple generations a year, shown on the two plots on the right, they benefited. So they get more generations in, they have higher abundances as a consequence of emerging earlier in the year. But those species that have a fixed one generation per year didn't benefit at all. And in fact, in some cases, there were disbenefits from that. So those two plots at the top show the species level data, and at the bottom they show the site level data. And those patterns are the same benefits for multivoltine species and not for univoltine species. So again, a mixed pattern of winners and losers. And what about the other question I asked at the start about evolutionary responses? Are there evolutionary responses taking place? And the quick answer is yes, but I'm not going to present any data on this, other than saying how important museum collections are in order to understand that. So it's great that I'm talking to you through the museum in Cambridge today. But these are data from the NHM, Natural History Museum in London. But just to say, yes, they've been really fantastic because they're a huge source of information. We can go along, we take the legs off this material and work out and go and sample more from exactly the same locations where these species were collected, perhaps 100 years ago, something like that, and then take new material as well, take their DNA and look to see how they've changed over time. And there's been a lot of evolutionary change over time. So that's a really interesting, and new research will come out of that to try and understand what the evolutionary drivers have been and how the butterflies have changed over time. I'd just like to sort of start finishing off now about thinking about what we can do to help, if you like. So a lot of people say, okay, you're telling us all, you're very often focusing on the losers and the doom and gloom. So what sort of things that can we do to take home a slightly more positive message this evening and think about sort of conservation optimism, I guess, about what we do to help butterflies? The question when people ask what can we do to help, I would immediately give a resounding yes, we can help. So what sort of things might we think about doing? Well, there's a lot of talk at the moment about nature recovery and things that we can do to enhance our landscapes for nature. And I guess lockdown and COVID a lot of people have got out and about into the countryside thinking about how we can improve it for biodiversity. So we're thinking about habitat corridors, stepping stones, and improving connectivity to help species shift their range. But one of the things from our results is that, of course, not all species benefit from these corridors, but some will. Quite interesting to talk about translocations and moving species around landscapes, particularly if they can't get there of their own accord. And there's lots of evidence of how we can manage landscapes and manage sites so that species can thrive if the habitat is suitable. And then there's quite a lot of discussion at the moment from the government's so-called 30 by 30 commitment. So for having 30% of the landscape in Britain protected by 2030. And the question then is, how can we ensure that that increased level of protection benefits species? So increasing protected area is probably going to be good, but those protected areas need to be better connected, and they also need to be better quality as well. So just to illustrate a few of these things. So should we move species around? This is quite a contentious issue, particularly in terms of moving them to locations where they have never been recorded. And that never, I guess, is in recent history. So that there is quite polarized views on this, I would say. Some people are very supportive and some people are very negative about that. Just like to point out that we have done this with full permission, I would, and full consultation. We've moved marbled white butterflies up into County Durham, about 60 or 70 kilometres from anywhere where they'd ever been recorded before. They're thriving there, they're still there, they haven't expanded hugely. And interestingly, when you look at the signboard now for the nature reserve, they actually talk about the butterfly being special to the site. So I guess over the 20 years since they've been released there, people have forgotten that they were translocated. And I guess that's an indication about acceptability about landscapes and what people don't tend to like change, but maybe after a period of time they do actually value species. And maybe the fact that the marbled white is such a beautiful insect, I mean, it's such a gorgeous butterfly, maybe people are more forgiving. But anyway, that's an interesting debate to have, and maybe there'll be some questions about that. Here's the plug for Jeremy Thomas's talk that will be coming up. I just talk about how, when we know about the how we know when we have the habitat correct and we understand best practice in conservation, understanding all the factors that are necessary for successful introductions, then it can be hugely successful, as you'll hear about more from Jeremy's talk and how it has been successfully introduced back into the UK after it went extinct in the 1970s. And I know you've also had talks about a checkered skipper last week as well, about the reintroduction into Rockingham Forest. So lots of great examples of how, if we know enough about the ecology and about what makes a site suitable with suitable management, then butterflies can be returned and reintroduced back to sites incredibly successfully. I'd also like to say a little bit about how we can manage sites incredibly successfully for very positive benefits for butterflies. So say about 10% of the UK land is protected for nature, but many of sites are in poor condition, but not all of them are. Some are flourishing. So here's a fantastic site in the Cotswolds in Gloucestershire, just a small site, only 10 hectares. Roughbank Reserve is managed for its butterflies, fantastic grassland site, and it's estimated about half of British butterflies are recorded in just this one 10-hectare site. So here's some conservation optimism, if you like. This is beautiful sites that can be managed for nature very, very effectively. So just to sort of finish off with some take-home messages then, to give plenty of time for questions. So the sorts of things I told you about then, the butterflies show considerable variation in their responses to climate change. And we know that habitat availability is important in terms of thinking about expansion rates and the degree to which butterflies have responded. And site management is crucial. And if you remember early on in my talk, I was saying how important it is for a species to be flourishing and to have positive population trends at a site in order to be able to respond and shift its range and track climate. So we know that habitat recreation may help some species and connectivity is important, but may not help all species. So there's more nuance in terms of thinking about where that's going to be effective and how more habitat recreation will deliver for nature. The work from Aldina Franco for our 4 northern species shows that butterflies are disappearing from sites. And so it's going to be very difficult to address those declines because they're declining because of climate change, and that's a global issue. So if you like, that will only be tackled when we tackle our net zero commitments and our greenhouse gas emissions. So just to finish off then, well, I hope you realise that from a lot of these analyses, butterflies have helped us by revealing this fingerprint of climate change. So they've helped us to understand that, but they also now need the help from us in order to restore and protect them and help them flourish in the future. So I'll leave it there and be happy to take questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Jane. That was brilliant. It's amazing how much things have changed so quickly in a lot of cases. But I also like that you finished with a positive note there as well. You're right. It's often a lot of doom and gloom when we talk about wildlife conservation, but there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot of positive things that have happened as well. So yeah, if you do have any questions for Jane, please do pop them in the Q&A on this Zoom call. There should be a button just at the bottom of your screen where you can put that in. As I wait for some questions to come through, we've also got some links that I can just pop in the chat with lots of information about butterflies, what you can do to help where you live, how you can help monitor species as well. And right at the end, the final link on here is just the questionnaire for you to get feedback about the talk. It's really helpful for us, again, just to tailor our content to our audience and see if you've enjoyed it. So I'm just going to pop that in the chat for you.
And I'll also put a plug in here for Butterfly Conservation as well. A fantastic charity. If you're not already a member, I'd really encourage you to do that. And of course, their website is brilliant as well. And a lot of the really great reserves, grassland reserves, for going to look for butterflies in the UK, some of those are managed by Butterfly Conservation. And there's some really great examples. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you. Again, more positive news there. I think that's really good. So I've got a question that's just come through from Sam. So many thanks for a fantastic talk. You mentioned using museum archive data to track genetic changes. Can you give any examples of how butterflies have evolved and responded to climate change?
So the quick answer to that is it's complicated because we have fantastic genetic information which tells us about genetic changes. So the Darwin Tree of Life project has set out with the aim of producing a genome, I think, for every British species. Is that sounds, it's a fantastic scheme it has. It's done every British butterfly. So we have the genome of every British butterfly has been sequenced. So that's a brilliant resource. And then you can go to the museum material and take off legs and collect the DNA from those. And you can go out and sample and collect DNA from modern material. And you can compare that and you can see where genetic diversity has changed. You can see which parts of the genome have changed. What we don't have good information on is how to then link that change in the genome to an actual function. And I think that's probably what you're asking me, can we actually say something about a feature of the butterfly has changed as a consequence, map it onto this genetic change? And that's hard to do. There is more information coming through, but not every genome for a butterfly has been well characterized to map a particular gene onto a particular function. The other thing, of course, is that there won't be a gene for climate change. Climate change will result in an evolutionary response, probably at multiple chromosomes in multiple locations. So again, it's quite hard then to specifically say this was a response coming about from climate change. But there are particular parts of the genome that you could look at to see if that would give a hint of a climate change response. And I guess the other thing to look at is there are other things that they may be responding to that may link back to climate change. You're thinking maybe here about coloration and so on. And maybe also see or rule out, see whether there are responses, for example, to pesticides and things like that. That may be more tractable. So sorry, that was a very long answer to a really interesting question. And I'm sorry, I'm going to be a typical scientist here and say it's pretty complicated to try and get a handle on that. But the technology is moving forward at quite a pace to be able to do that. And that would be fantastic to see, I think, over the next few years to make those linkages. I suppose the other thing I would say is that because species are going locally extinct, species cannot evolve themselves out of problems from climate change, but that can't happen, but maybe evolutionary changes will happen that will slow up that response. But evidence that, say, some of our northern species are going extinct would be evidence that you can't keep track of evolution through you can't keep track of climate change through evolution. And the evidence from the paleo record and from fossils and so on is the same. Species shift their ranges mostly rather than adapt in situ.
Thank you so much. That's brilliant. Yeah, I think you're right. The with how technology and using museum specimens with genomic work is kind of evolving in the time that we're in now. It's really exciting to see where that work goes. But yeah, brilliant question. We have another one from Alison now. Have you done any work involving the effect of predators and parasites, etc., on butterfly populations?
No, I haven't. I know some people have looked to see whether some of the range expansion happens as a consequence of them escaping parasitoids and predators, and there is some evidence of that. And also there is some suggestion that some of the species that cycle hugely have boom and bust years. That's also linked back to parasitoids as well. I think that's a really interesting question. I don't think there's a huge amount of information available for British butterflies, the degree to which they have their own specialist parasitoid. Because of course, if you expand your range, you might pick up parasitoids that occur that are, attacking other species that are in the location where you turn up. But that's a really interesting thing to see. And I suppose that links back to other questions about the degree to which species shifting their range influences the local ecosystems in that from arrival and disappearance. And so thinking about more broader questions about sort of trophic interactions and community level responses, I think is really interesting as well. The one thing I would say is that one of the things that I do often get asked that is linked to this question is the degree to which butterflies are limited by their larval host plants and whether their larval host plants are shifting at the same rate that they are. And one of the interesting things about British butterflies is that I think there's only one butterfly that's actually limited by its host plant. All the other species are limited in the UK by climate. So as soon as the climate warms up, species can spread northwards and their host plants are there waiting for them, if you like. They're not having to wait for their host plants to keep track as well. So if we take my example of the speckled wood, well, though the larvae there feed on quite a few species of grasses, so once the woodland area is warm enough for them to turn up, then there's no limit, well, there's a very little limit to the amount of grass for the larvae, and that's true for a wide range of butterflies as well. So that may not be typical of other species in other contexts, for which they may depend on other elements of the landscape to improve or change or shift as well, not just the climate. So there are some things for which butterflies may not be a good example of.
It's really interesting. Again, I think it highlights what you said just before about there's so much going on with climate, predator, prey interactions, parasitoids, the host plant. It's a really complex pattern, all being impacted by the envelope of climate change as well. In terms of parasites, I don't know if Jeremy will talk about this in his talk, but I know the large blue butterfly has some really interesting interactions with parasitoid wasps as well. So definitely tune back in to find out more about that.
Absolutely, that's a fantastic system, because of all the interactions that you have with that particular butterfly. I suppose the other thing to bear in mind as well is the extent to which communities and species have always been dynamic. So the climate has always changed. The issue now, of course, is it's getting warmer than humans. The levels of CO2 are going to be higher than anything that humans have experienced, and so on. So the range shifting and the movement and the dynamism of nature, if you like, that's not new. Arguably, the rate at which it's changing is different. But when you look into the fossil record, species have always moved around the globe. So I think it's important to recognise that level of dynamism and think a bit about what if you like is normal for species versus what is abnormal as a consequence of what we're doing to the world around us through fossil fuel burning and changes in greenhouse gas emissions.
That's great. Yeah, really important point. Another question from Alison. I just wanting some more details really on how do you take a DNA sample from a butterfly?
You get permission from the curators because you don't want to damage material, but I think there's also recognition that the DNA from the sample itself is a valuable part to be associated with that specimen, and you can get useful information from the DNA in the leg from a museum material. I mean, if it's a recently collected individual that you've just sampled that day, then you can just sort of crunch it all together and stick it into take it to your lab and do all your DNA analyses. So we take legs, and the reason for that is that DNA decays if it doesn't dry very quickly after the death of the insect. So most of the body parts are not helpful because the DNA will have deteriorated as that butterfly has been pinned out and has gradually dried. So the legs turn out to be the best thing, and also of course that means that for a butterfly in a museum collection, you're not damaging it too badly, and you're still retaining the wings and the coloration and so on. And so then what you can then associate with each specimen, once you've done your analyses, you can then hand back your vial of DNA so that that's associated with the specimen for other people to use in future as well. So how you actually then take the DNA out is then depends on the particular method you choose to use and the level of information you wish to get. So if you're just doing a DNA barcode, for example, you'd need far less DNA and far less detailed approach than if you're wanting to do the whole genome, for example.
That's great. No, again, really interesting way of using museum specimens. And then if you've barcoded it, you can have it there for other people to use in the future. Having this repository of information is fantastic. Question from Toby. How many butterflies have become extinct in the UK since the 1970s? Putting you on the spot there.
So I think it's going to only be the large blue, because I think Mazarine blue, black veined white, large copper, I think they had already gone extinct by then.
I think you're right as well. I think
it is just large blue, and that's been reintroduced. So if you're going to be positive about it, you'd say actually we have the same number of species, or possibly even more than we did in the 1970s, because we got a few turning up. I guess the concern, of course, I don't want to be blasé about the concern we have about insect declines. The concern is not extinction in terms of that's the last one you've seen in the UK. Perhaps we shouldn't be too focused around that particular instance, but actually the fact that many species are declining, even if they haven't quite yet disappeared from the UK. But I can't think of any others that have gone extinct. I think it is just large blue, and then that was obviously Jeremy will tell you more next time about how that's been reintroduced. But there was something I saw actually on my Twitter feed today about butterfly conservation and others releasing a new red list of British butterflies today, showing sadly that more have become designated red lists, but also others are recovering. So with resources and appropriate conservation management, we can turn around species declines. But I guess that comes back round to how much resource we want to spend and who is going to do that in order to be effective. And then there are also the situation where those species that are declining, like for example mountain ringlet, for which the degree to which habitat management can overcome the detrimental impacts of climate change at sites. So I know there's a lot of focus around managing sites to try and make them cooler, for example, so that we can slow up declines in the hope that we move towards a climate negative future when the global temperatures might decline.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Again, this sort of similar to what I had a question prepped in case, and it's to do with the short term. We probably will get more species, but there is quite a short term view of things. And as you mentioned in your talk, the various species that are already at the limits of where they are, and the overall declines of the majority of species. We might not have lost them yet, but they are suffering. Adrian Smith says the local record centre does not get records from iNaturalist. I guess maybe asking about. I know I personally have used iRecord before and things like that. I guess if you could talk to the use of local record centres and iNaturalist, perhaps.
I can say I'm sure other apps are available. Perhaps that's the thing I should say. Yeah, no, sorry, I just picked out iNaturalist as one, but absolutely, people have different reasons and different motivations, I think, for recording, and absolutely that there are other ways in which you can join in and record things, and so yeah, no, absolutely, you do whatever you prefer, and what you would most value in terms of also finding out how your records contribute to your local area. I think I can understand completely how that's important.
No, really good answer. And I think iNaturalist tends to be more global, and iRecord I think is more UK based, but I do know that some of the iRecord data goes into local record centres. So exactly what Jane said. I think there's lots of these apps available, which is great.
Yeah.
Bex says, with trends of butterflies generally moving northwards, do you expect any particular non-native species to begin being recorded in southern Britain?
Oh, yeah. So this is an interesting one. So it leads into much wider discussions about what we mean by non-native and what is native or not, and which species we might give a hand to or not. And it'd be an interesting discussion to have with Jeremy about whether the large blue in Britain is native or not, given that it's genetically not British, it's come from elsewhere. Anyway, so these are really interesting discussions about what is a British species and what's non-native, and I completely understand the question that's being asked. So generally speaking, people consider native species as those that have got here of their own accord, whether that be after the last ice age or currently. So in other words, haven't needed human intervention or haven't been carried by people to get here. So there'll be more examples of things that are in Europe, sort of waiting to get across and to arrive. And we hear about new species turning up that are colonising the UK of their own accord. And there'll be species in Europe who will eventually turn up in this country. So the map I always think is an interesting one that might turn up in Britain. And then I guess the question is, would we want to give any of them a helping hand? So if we wanted black vein whites back in Britain, would we bring them back rather than waiting for them to arrive? So yeah, I suppose you could go and look through a map of European butterflies and see which ones are the closest to the channel and are likely to pop across next. And quite a few more things that used to be more rare are turning up more frequently. So some of the migrants are turning up more frequently, seeing more large tortoiseshells and so on. And I guess I wonder whether monarchs will start breeding. They turn up on the Welsh coast not infrequently in the Scilly Isles, and will they start breeding here as well?
It's really interesting you mentioned the large tortoiseshell, because we just had a question through saying, when did the large tortoiseshell become extinct in the country, and are there plans to try and bring it back? Because it's always been quite low numbers over the last few decades, really, at least, hasn't it? But yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's quite a mobile species. I think it'll do fine. My projection would be it'll do quite fine itself once the climate gets warm enough for it. And I say it is, my understanding is that it is turning up more often than it did, but then maybe there's more people out looking for it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, No, definitely. I think you're right. It's one of the species. When we were talking about those that went extinct, I have seen it definitely classified as becoming extinct, but they keep popping up, as you say, Jane. The little numbers of them, they've been seen breeding recently, which is, well, good news, I guess. From M. Faris, in 2021, I had the chance to conduct Lepidopteran's diversity study in several agricultural sites in Malaysia. One of my findings was there are abundance of pest species collected. Does the agriculture have any significant effects on the overall butterfly diversity or distribution?
So I'm not quite sure whether there's a suggestion there that some butterflies are pests.
I think so.
Because there are Lepidoptera that are pests, and that includes butterflies and moths. And I mean, I'm sure some of us with allotments will think of large whites as pests and so on. So yeah, I mean, their climate change is increasing pests as well as other species as well. So it's having a huge impact on communities, and so insects that do economic harm, some of those will be benefiting in the same way that some of the species of conservation interest are spreading north as well.
Definitely. I should have said, sorry, the large tortoiseshell question was from Shirley, so thank you very much for that one. And then the last question I think we have is, oh no, we've got two left. One's from Rebecca. What are the best plants to grow in the garden to attract butterflies? Lovely question.
So even though it's a non-native, I have a nice buddleia bush in my backyard, which I really like, particularly in the autumn, to see things nectaring on that. And I've also planted is it alder buckthorn in my hedge to get brimstones, and they turned up almost immediately once it was planted, which was just absolutely fantastic. But I guess it depends where you live and what sort of butterflies you're wanting to bring into your garden, and whether you're looking for nectar plants or for larval host plants. But there's lots of good information on somewhere like the Butterfly Conservation webpage for which are good plants to go for, and they're not only going to benefit butterflies, of course, they're going to be good for a wide range of British insects. If I go to a garden centre, I always look to see which plants have got insects around them when I'm buying them, as a sort of a good guide as to
that's a good tip. Yeah. That's great. No, I think in the links we've actually sent through, if you look in the chat, we've got various of those links to Butterfly Conservation and UK Butterfly websites. I know they have a full list of nectaring plants throughout the year. So if you, depending on when you would like your plants to flower and support different pollinators, they have a list there. And as Jane was saying, for the caterpillars as well, they've got some different food plants for them, and other tips and things as well. Some really nice advice on, if we're lucky enough to have our own green spaces, what we can do to help too. The last one actually wasn't a question. It was an anonymous attendee saying, in case useful to know, research grade observations on iNaturalist do go towards GBIF and NBN Atlas. So these kind of national and international databases on the positioning of where species distribution are. So that's great.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the really good things. I mean, I guess some people complain about people being glued to their iPhone and so on, but actually that sort of modern technology where you can combine an ID app for people who are not quite sure what they've seen with an upload to a data depository with an accurate timestamp and location, that level of information that would be coming in is just phenomenal. Because of course, as you go back to those periods of time before people had iPhones, your ability to know exactly where you were in the UK was limited, and so the spatial resolution of data is quite coarse as you go back in time. But now, if that's how people are doing most of their records, then the information will be very very precise and really high value.
That's brilliant. I think that brings us to the end of our questions this evening. Thank you all so much for joining, and a huge thank you to Jane as well for your talk this evening, and to have all those positive messages to go along with what we can do to help butterflies as well. That just leaves me to say really that this was the fourth talk in our Researcher Stories series for the Butterflies Through Time exhibition. Please do tune back in next week on Wednesday at 7 p.m, where we have PhD student Esme Ash Jepson on her talk entitled Cool as a Caterpillar, the Challenges and Opportunities of Researching Across the Life Cycle. So that looks to be a really interesting talk there. Thank you again, everyone. I hope you had a good time, and hopefully see you next week.